AR ve VR'da kurumsal kullanımlar konulu konuşması için VR/AR danışmanı, aynı zamanda Raptor Dance Games kurucusu Barngrover'ı sahneye davet ediyorum. Kendisini çok az bekleyeceğiz.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here today and to speak with you. I really want to thank the organizers for giving me such a great reason to come to Ankara for the first time. I've lived in Turkey for many years, but this is the first time I've come to the capital. I've lived in Konya, and I've lived now in Istanbul for many years. So I'm a VR developer, and I'll tell you very briefly about myself before we get right into it. My presentation tends to be light on theory, because a lot of people have heard about these things already. So I get right into how people are using these technologies to create value for their organizations and their institutions. So very briefly, I am a VR developer. I'm a graduate of Boğaziçi University's management department. I also studied in the US before I came to Turkey. I'm an in-residence developer at the VR First Lab at Bahçeşehir University. I am also a trainer with the Karma Lab, which is Koç University's new mixed reality laboratory. So I am deeply involved with both VR and AR laboratories in Istanbul, where a lot of interesting things are happening. So from these images, they look quite cartoonish because we're working in laboratories at universities. But my area of focus is actually primarily cultural heritage work. I do a lot of photogrammetry work, which is the recreation of real-world sites using photographs. But let's get right into what we're talking about today. So, many of you have probably heard and seen presentations about augmented reality and virtual reality and mixed reality. Very quickly, these terms are separated by virtual reality being the placement of an individual in a completely virtual environment. There is no view of the real world around them. Augmented reality and mixed reality, however, are where the user is seeing the world around them, but in the case of augmented reality, they are simply being provided some additional information, like a heads-up display, which has been around for many, many decades in use cases, or in mixed reality, which is much newer, which is the placement of virtual objects seamlessly into the world around them, so that there is this mixed reality of what is virtual and what is real, and the user can interact with them in this way. So all of these technologies have been in development for decades, have found uses for several decades, but we can say that they haven't been very widespread until in the last about 6-7 years. And the reason for that is the consumer sector has finally caught up with what's been going on in university laboratories. And that's brought the price down, it's brought the size down of the equipment necessary to create these types of virtual experiences. Here's an image of a worker at Walmart, a large supermarket in the United States. And this was probably the world's first largest mainstream adoption of virtual reality as a tool for enterprise. And what they use it for is they use it for training. Training in virtual reality is a very easy to sell case. It's a very easy to sell use case because the primary value is cost reduction. If you can digitize your training, you don't need to pay so many trainers. You can increase the frequency and the rate of training. And that's what Walmart did. So what they ultimately did, they've invested a couple $100 million to buy many of these Oculus Go's. These are mid-level consumer VR headsets. They've sent them out to every store that they have, and they've made their entire library of training available. Now, what does VR training offer that, say, video training does not? What it offers is the potential for performance. There's a performative aspect of training in VR because VR is a physical action. It is not usually, in its most realized form, sitting in a chair and watching a static scene. even though they use 360 video here. 360 video is not really a VR experience, it's more of an immersive but passive experience. They augment it by letting the users make decisions. They have to respond to questions, they have to respond to virtualized crises and react appropriately. And so Walmart is just one example, but many other companies have followed their lead in the last 2 years to also invest many hundreds of millions of dollars in virtualizing their training in areas that are much more dangerous, much more sophisticated than Walmart. Volkswagen is a very good example of that. So this recurring theme that will come up is that these immersive technologies are in and of themselves, they're not products, these are mediums. Whatever you do in this medium, the value created does not come from the medium. The value creation comes from what you decide to build inside of that medium. So in Walmart's case, the value creation is that they can recreate situations that may only happen once a year, for example, Black Friday. Because of that, they can simulate that training as many times as they want. The users can do it according to their schedule, not according to an institutional schedule. More recently, we've seen this major investment, which many of you are probably familiar with, the US Army investing $500 million into this project with Microsoft for the HoloLens. So the industrial sector, the consumer industrial sector, has been adopting these technologies for a while. But even before that, the defense sector has been trying to adopt these technologies, but with limited results. That's starting to change because now, again, the consumer end hardware has become so small that it's making it much more feasible to develop the kind of tools and experiences that can create value, that can be used to create value, excuse me. So in this case, Microsoft will supply several tens of thousands of HoloLenses over the course of the next several years and will develop various types of visualization tools, training tools for it. Similarly, we're seeing development in the private sector and municipal sectors for other types of dangerous training simulations. So again, the primary value for VR training is that you can lower costs, you can increase the frequency, and you can reduce the need for specialists. The other fundamental value of virtual reality is that you can go to places you otherwise cannot go. Dangerous places, faraway places, places that don't exist. And so once you're there, you can do many different things. And so what they do here, the Apex officer training, Apex is maybe the new leader in this particular subsector in the US. They're developing training simulations for police departments around the United States. In this case, obviously, you see high stress and a dangerous environment, but most of the training is tended to focus on de-escalation. And so de-escalation, you will see later in another example, but de-escalation here is the value. It's not making a higher performing combat unit here in the police departments. It's how to de-escalate and how to work with local communities. Pardon me one moment. Okay. So not just with police departments, but we're also having this with fire departments in the US. And in both cases, we're seeing these head-mounted displays becoming small enough that they can be deployed very easily and very cheaply. Here, the head-mounted display is inside of a helmet. And you see things with the HoloLens. This is what the HoloLens is able to do now. The HoloLens being a small, standalone display, it can be embedded into hard hats, it can be embedded into other customized headwear. In this case, this is something called see-through. This is a tool that's being developed for firefighters to be able to have infrared views of buildings and environments that are currently inflamed. The value here, aside from simply being able to view, is that now we can augment that. Because infrared views have been around for a long time, but with this we can now use image analysis that we have available to be able to instruct and guide the firefighter when they're on site. things that they cannot otherwise do easily when they're in this high-stress environment. So again, being able to see already is a value, but the real value creation would come from creating a tool that can analyze that environment. The problem and the big challenge with this, both for the police if it was to be made in a real-time situation, and for firefighters in this situation, is that for image analysis to work, you're typically referencing a library of previously defined objects. So if, for example, this firefighter goes into this burning room, to augment them, in addition to simply the visual, to augment what they're able to perceive, the information they're able to process, we need to know something about this environment. We need to be able to identify objects. We need to be able to identify perhaps the floor that they're on, where they are in a building. Accessing the building plans becomes essential to really enhance the information that can be provided to these people when they're engaged. And that information is typically not available. So what holds back the real value creation of many of these tools is that right now, as intelligent as they are, they're not intelligent enough to act dynamically. This is one of the reasons why augmented reality is still less fully developed as a tool for in-the-field work than VR is for training work. So similar to the de-escalation examples that we had with the Apex officer training, human resources are beginning to adopt these types of tools where you can simulate difficult conversations, because now we're able to create human-like analogs, avatars that can respond dynamically to your speech and your actions, your body language. And so this is being used to improve the soft skills of executives. But of course, this can be expanded way beyond this. Many decades ago, the US Army invested in games, simple games, that attempted to improve the soft skills of their soldiers in Iraq, and by identifying the body language and the phrasings and the general behavior of Iraqis. And so not to react instinctively, reflexively according to American expectations, but able to react according to culturally appropriate customs. And so this is, again, becoming much more common for large multinational corporations, and you'll see this slowly roll out, because the technology being used here is consumer, it's off the shelf. The most complicated bit of this particularly is not so much the human avatar, though that is quite complicated to make the face react in a believable way, but it actually is the use of the Watson's or the Microsoft speech recognition software, which is limited, of course, to certain languages more than others. We're seeing VR, again, and I keep coming back to VR because VR is the far more developed platform and medium right now compared to augmented reality. VR is used to improve operational design. So here we see BMW designing their facility in real time. The facility has not been built yet. And what they're doing, they're able to test out the location, the arrangement, and the sequence in which activities and tasks have to be done. If it does not perform accordingly, they're able to dynamically, while they're in VR, to rearrange it, to change it. And this is not meant to be only a VR experience. This is multi-platinum, not multi-platinum, multi-platform. The user who's in VR is synchronized with those who are on a traditional desktop or those in an AR display, and they are actively communicating. So this is now a collaborative tool, a collaborative design tool. And aside from cutting down the severe cost of developing, I guess maybe my microphone wasn't working. Aside from being able to cut down the cost of developing these the different iterations and the mock-ups for these types of these facilities, what we're able to do is we're also able to test to see whether or not our expectations of human behavior are accurate. We can see, before we build the assembly line and train our workers on how to operate it, we can go through many, many iterations and many, many tests to verify that humans will perform the way we expect them to perform here, at the rate and the speed and at the level of comfort that is necessary to do their tasks properly. And finally, we also have a lot of VR coming up into product design. I apologize. in the product design, the same way we have with operational design, we're able to iterate much faster because now we don't have to spend as much time and resources on mock-ups that we have to wait to be constructed. Even 3D printing, as fast as it is not as fast as simply taking your 3D designs directly into virtual space. And in doing so, you can sculpt it if you choose to, you can manipulate it, you can take it apart. Again, assuming that what you have in your library, what it is you're viewing, is fundamentally capable of that. So if, for example, I have a car and I have this car model, in this case, this is Audi, and I want to explode it, I want to take it apart, then I had to have designed that to be done in that manner. I have to design each of those pieces and components separately. And this is why when you see a tool like this, you see an excellent tool being applied in the field, you're actually only seeing about 10% of this actual product. 90% is everything that goes behind it to make it possible, the integration with their own IT systems, their databases for their asset libraries, and everything else. In Volkswagen's case, they've invested an entire training and design tool, which is applied across their entire group of companies. And that actually took, apparently, 2 years longer than they expected, not because the VR component was challenging. The VR component was done very early. What was actually challenging was the integration with everything else. And that's, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And so, again, when you see VR applications or AR applications presently, and you're thinking, well, we're not seeing a whole lot of added value there. We're not seeing, you know, it's kind of a gimmick. And the reason it's a gimmick is because the decision makers who are greenlighting these types of projects are typically looking at the final product. They're looking at the final visualization and not thinking about all the steps that go into integrating that with what the company is already doing or the organization is already doing. And so while there are many studios and development houses here in Turkey who are creating these types of tools and are quite skilled at it, oftentimes they're hamstrung by not being integrated fully into the organization, the client's organization, in order to take the necessary time and steps to get maximum synergy and value. And so as a takeaway for today, the main point of all of these is that it's becoming very easy to create VR and AR applications. It's a hobby level. I wouldn't say it's consumer level, but it is hobby level, and that skill is right here in Turkey. You don't have to go outside of Turkey to get it. But if you want to get any type of real value, if you want to have a successful project or program, then you need to approach it as a full IT project, a full software development project, and look at bringing in the necessary experts on your side to develop that project from the beginning, rather than assuming that simply setting a target for an outside developer will be sufficient to deliver what it is that you need. And so that's actually going to be it for me. So thank you very much for your time, and I think that's what we'll finish at. Thank you. Thank you.
Wait. Teşekkürler. Michael Barngrover'a teşekkür ediyoruz.